Welcome to the Church is a Team Sport podcast. My name is Lance Wigton. I'm with my friend Jim Putman. The reason for this podcast, and we're glad that you're joining us right now, is we really want to talk to all the pastors out there, especially the pastors of smaller churches. 7 out of 10 churches are less than 100 people. And Jim and I are both preacher's kids. And so essentially from birth, we were a part of a church, and we know the ins and outs of churches, and yet here we are still working for a church. But there's a lot of things we've learned, and a lot of those things are in Church as a Team Sport that Jim wrote. But a lot of those things are not, and we want to talk about those things, marry that with the book, and our goal is to really help you and hope that we give you tools through this podcast. You were a preacher's kid, but you were a Christian growing up, but some of your experiences in the smaller church, the churches that your dad was in, actually impacted your relationship with Christ.
Well, yeah, I would say I grew up Christian, but when I started to be able to make my own choices, they went pretty far away from being Christian until eventually I denied Christ, that I believed that it was a real story and all that. And, much like you and you as well, I mean, you grew up in a preacher's home, and when we planted this church all those years ago, I had left being involved in the church prior to coming back to ministry. You were not serving in the church. You were not volunteering in the church. You were not a pastor in the church. And when we started this 25 years ago, you were a part of Church as a Team Sport. You were even in there. You were the Mongolian chef.
I'm the Mongolian chef.
Yeah. And, the way church functioned, it wasn't a positive experience for me, for you. And in fact, I came out as going, I would never be involved in this the way this thing's running.
Well, I remember the first time we were at a meeting, which, I mean, our first meeting to me was such a call from God by itself, because it was right in the middle of the Broncos Packers Super Bowl, right in the middle, and I knew it was going to be a great game.
Yeah.
And so obviously God was testing me, but we had this opportunity, and we were going to meet you and Aaron, and I remember you talking about how different you wanted this church versus other churches, and that immediately resonated with me. My dad, instead of like where you went to multiple churches, because your dad was a church planner, I was just in one church there in Sandpoint. But the church was somewhere between 300 and 400 growing up, and I was a teenager. But my dad was the lone guy. If there was a problem, he did all the preaching. If there was a problem in anybody's family, which was pretty common, he'd get the phone call. And so growing up, we'd get a phone call, and I just assumed he was going to be leaving, and he was gone almost every night because he was doing all of it. But your vision for the church and how that was going to be different on even that first night when you were talking about starting Real Life Ministries, even though we didn't know what it was called that then, was much different. Do you remember?
Well, that part of why you and I resonated is that we had the same kind of background as pastors' kids, but we are also sports guys, football guys. And so there were certain things that we knew about sports that were not applied to churches. Part of my journey was, to me, I didn't want to be a part of the church. Even though I had come to accept Christ eventually, I was like, okay, I'll accept Jesus, but never the church. And my reason for that was the church was a losing team. I was on national championship teams, state championship teams. I didn't want to be on a losing team. And the church was a losing team. And the reason I felt that way was because it was all built around one person's personality. He was doing everything. It was impacting his family. Most of the people, it's like, in sports where they want to wear the letterman's jacket, but they don't actually want to do what it takes to be, a starter. I mean, I want to be on the team, but I'll sit in the stands and cheer, and I'll go on the trips, but as far as working super hard to be the best at something, no. And so the whole way the church was built was built on a personality or the work of one person. The others were the spectators. If they were really spiritual, they might work in children's ministry or be an usher, but they didn't share their faith very much. They didn't, invite people to church. They wanted what they wanted. They wanted the sermon. They wanted to be fed. They wanted to be entertained. They didn't want to be bored. They were, it reminds me of the Muppets, the two guys up in the stands pointing and laughing and making fun of, that's
pure spectators.
Yeah. And my dad, when he won me to the Lord, he admitted that, and he had changed as time went on. When his way of parenting and doing the church wasn't working for our home, he made some changes. And then he started going, you know what? This church model I was handed, it wasn't the right model. And he was willing to talk about that. And he did life with me. I don't remember a sermon he ever preached, but he discipled me. And part of that was helping me understand that I was saved from something for something, and that I should be a part of the church. He said, listen, all these skills and these experiences were supposed to be, God played a part in even that, so that you could use these things as a part of his work in the church. And I'm like, nothing I learned about sports, any of that, are useful in the church, except for, I was a fighter. I could teach people how to fight,
right?
But they already had that down verbally.
Yes,
I mean,
churches are known to be pretty good at that.
Yeah, I mean, they could fight. So what, I'm going to teach them how to really hurt each other, But no, he's like, no, all the coaching, all the stuff. Ephesians 4 talks about pastors are equippers of the saints. Those are coaches. Their job is to help people use their gifts and abilities and get them involved. And the church becomes the body of Christ, the family of God. And so your job is to raise up people. And you learned in wrestling how to be a coach to raise up wrestlers. And those skill sets, he helped me connect. And that's part of discipleship. He helped me connect my scars, my abilities to the work of God. And so I was like, wow, okay. And he said, listen, in wrestling, how did they set up practices? What were the goals? And then how does that apply to the church? And like I remember thinking, if I were to use the church's methodology for disciple making in wrestling, what would that look like? Okay, so once a week, I'm going to have a 35-minute message where I talk about wrestling moves, right? And
almost the philosophy of it.
Yeah.
Not the actual move itself. It would be why
I'll
you
talk about the
want to do
rules of wrestling.
Yeah,
I've got the playbook out. I'm going to talk about the rules. And I might even go, hey, let me show you a single leg. Come up. I'm going to show you a single leg, and I'm going to do it on the stage. You guys just watch. Next week, come back. I'll show you a double leg. And then we're going to sing some songs about wrestling.
Right.
Wrestling is great. Wrestling is wonderful. Maybe we'll have a little cracker and juice because wrestlers are always hungry. They're always cutting weight,
right.
And I started thinking through that, and it got pretty ridiculous. But at the end of the day, if I use that methodology in wrestling, what is the best I was ever going to get? Informed spectators. Like parents.
You weren't going to win anything, that's for sure.
Yeah. Like parents who yell at their kids, do this, do that, but they've never actually done it themselves. Kids who don't actually wrestle, so again, they're informed spectators. Hey, that's a single leg. Hey, that's not right. You can't do that, but they can't actually do it. So then I thought, what if I started using in wrestling and used what we did to help wrestlers become good wrestlers and then coaches? What if we use that in the church? And what I found was Jesus's methodology was right there. And a lot of times we look at Jesus for who he is and the doctrines, but we don't look at his methodology that he used for making disciples. What if I showed you a move and then I gave you an opportunity to practice the move with somebody, and you're practicing, and then you start slow.
While you're watching me.
While I'm watching, and I'm coaching, and I'm speeding things up. And at the end of the day, what do I want? I want a wrestler who can wrestle. I want a wrestler who can wrestle against a moving opponent. They can actually win and even show somebody else how to do it. That's discipleship. But the way we were doing it wasn't working. It wasn't creating an army that you unleash on a community. It was, at best, a gathering out of the community. And if they did have somebody they wanted to know Jesus, they brought the pastor to do it and disciple, which then, how many people can the disciple maker like that disciple if it requires relationship, not very many.
Right.
And then take care of all the needs and all the funerals and the weddings and the counseling. And I'm going to teach you how to be a disciple, but it's going to be class. It's informational. And I'm not going to show you anything or watch you do anything because I'm trying to help everybody at the same time. And the way the church was working was not producing what we claimed we valued.
Now, when you're at Oregon City, I just think it's fascinating the way God set up your story, because here you are coaching wrestling, literally coaching wrestling, and you're also over the youth group there at Oregon City.
Yeah.
And so by doing both of those things at the same time, you were able to sync those two things, and then it brought up for you, you could see the gap in the rest of the church and your youth group that was now doing this thing, and the gap is really what caused you to plant a church.
Yeah. Well, to me, wrestling was a great way to be on the campus. I went there as a youth minister, went in, and it's an interesting story. I went in and said, hey, I'd like to help with the wrestling team. But the coach had just told everybody he resigned. So I was a 3-time state champion, 3-time college All-American. And so when I went in to say, hey, I'd like to do this, he was like, hey, do you want the job?
Mm-hmm. And you were just trying to get a
way
foot
in the school,
door, basically. Yeah.
So I could walk the campus and for youth ministry.
Right.
And so when he asked me that, I said, well, what's the record? How good is the team? And he was like, oh, it's a great team. And I go, so I asked the next question, which was, all right, well, how many state champions? How'd you do in districts, dual meets? He said, oh, no, we haven't really won a dual in many, many years.
Well, how do they have a great team then?
Well, yeah. I was like, so why do you say it's a great team? Oh, we have more wrestlers coming out than we have ever had before.
Quantity.
And so in my mind, I go, well, if the goal is that they win, that just means you have more kids who don't know how to wrestle on your wrestling team if they're not growing and learning and winning, right?
Yeah.
And I come to find out they didn't have a little kids program. They didn't have a junior high program. All their freshmen were coming in first year, and they were brand new wrestlers, but everybody else in the district had little kids and junior high. And so these kids have been wrestling 7 years. Your kid's been wrestling 1 year.
No wonder they're getting mauled.
Yeah, they're getting mauled. But at the time, I'm like, this is just like the church. The church thinks they're winning because they have more kids, more people than ever before because they had some sort of conversion sort of thing. But that's not the goal, is to have more people on the team. I mean, that's part of the goal.
Yeah.
But not because you're doing all the work for them and they're sitting there being spectators. It's that you're building kids who can actually wrestle spiritually. And when you think about the church, if we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces, we're not doing a good job of raising up spiritual wrestlers for their home, for the souls of other people. They don't wrestle. They don't know how to wrestle because they're just spectators. And it is a correlation. So just like I had to start in that church with a junior high and high school program and then raise them up so that they hit the adulthood, I had to start a little kids program, a junior high program, so that by the time they got there, now they've been wrestling 5 years like everybody else.
Right.
And I was trying to create wrestlers and teams that could win. In the church, what caused me to go, okay, I'm done with this, is I'm raising up these kids to be disciple makers, but when they hit the church, the adult church, there was nothing for them. All the things that we had built, small groups, discipleship, all those things, there was nothing. There was just a church service, and it wasn't very good church service, and it wasn't good preaching, and it wasn't good music, and it wasn't good. And beyond that, I mean, that's nothing compared to there was no small groups, there was no ministry, there was no relationship. So I keep funneling these kids into this adult area where they're just going away. There's
It'd be
nothing
like
for
your
them.
wrestling kids that you had work up through the kids program. Now all of a sudden they're going to play a completely different sport in high school. So it's like, what is the point you're trying to raise them to when they're not even playing the same game?
Yeah. So I was just like, okay, I'm not going to keep funneling kids into somewhere where we're going to keep losing them. They're not wanted. They're more mature in some ways than most of the people in the church. And so I was like, okay, if I'm really gonna make a difference, then I gotta quit being the tail that wags the dog. We gotta go and start a church, which is part of my journey. And it was the Lord had a bunch of stuff, and it's in the book, how it all came to be. It was obvious God wanted to make it happen. He did all kinds of miracles. And all I was doing, guys, all I'm doing is saying, it's interesting how in sports or music, getting people aligned, practicing together, all this stuff, it's interesting how these other sports, or even AA, how did AA, you go and you're open and honest. Here's my name is Jim Putman. I'm an alcoholic. I've been sober for whatever, or I want to get sober. You get a sponsor, you get relationship. You don't just go have a talk about, what is inebriation? What's the point of inebriation? And no, you how is it that the church doesn't make disciples, but AA did? How is it that the church isn't making disciples, but in sports you become a disciple of a sport? Or some activity. How did we lose the goals? How did pastors become the entertainers or the laborer for everybody? The one guy. How did this happen where it's just about education, right doctrine, but not about lifestyle, not about relationship? How did all of this happen? And again, there's a lot of ways and theories and that did happen, but our goal isn't to just complain about what happened. It's to go, no, I'm going to take the box that I was handed, and I'm going to compare that box to the Word of God. And if this box doesn't compare to that, Jesus' methodology, Jesus' design, not just the teachings of Jesus, but the methods of Jesus, if the church isn't the first church that God designed, quit living in the box and make the changes that are necessary so that what you're producing is what you value.
I just remember when the first time that you talked about people, your job is not to be the paid player. Your job is to coach and get people to play on the team. And I just remember thinking how different that was, and the outcome of people getting to live out whatever their experiences that God had them through, whatever their talents and abilities, and getting them to put all that effort into serving the church, what the impact that would be on the people, and how different their relationship with Christ would be, and even their relationship with the church. My dad had, not only was he friends with your dad, but he was friends with a lot of pastors here in the Pacific Northwest, and those guys would all get together and they kind of tell war stories about, basically their congregations were
war zones.
There were war zones. Yeah, these guys were were after them, and if they didn't like the preaching, or there was always some kind of problem. And you talked about this church, and I got to thinking, well, no wonder that these churches are so angry. It's because they're just sitting there watching this guy. Much like I watch a football game and I'm complaining about the coach. I'm sitting on my couch. I
throw it to him, you idiot. He's open. Well, you're not being chased by 400-pound guys. Yeah.
But you get someone that's playing. Now they're on the field. Now they're the ones being chased by they're not even caring about what you're doing. Because they've got their own.
Or if somebody else makes a mistake, they understand. Yeah, it ain't so easy. I've been there. I've done that, and they give grace to each other rather than criticizing the person who's out there playing.
100%. And you take, you hear these guys that are getting ready to retire or whatever, and you would think what they're going to miss is scoring the touchdown, the winning, the whatever. They always talk about the thing they missed the most, and the thing they knew they were going to miss the most was the locker room. And you're in the heat of the battle. You'll go the extra mile because the person next to you is going the extra mile.
Unless the locker room's empty and you're there by yourself.
That's exactly right.
And you're doing everything. Then you don't miss it at all. But if you have the Lord's way of doing things, where we're co-laborers, we're doing it together, we're friends, the support we have, the people that we do life with, now it's hard. I can't imagine, the things you've meant to me in my life as a friend, and the other folks that we're doing this together with, all these years and all the support and the failure and helping each other up and the fighting and then having to get it worked out, because what else are we going to do? We're on the same team. Yeah, I don't know how you make it. When on my wrestling teams, people are always like, well, that's an individual sport. No, not really. You can't get good at anything if you don't have a drill partner. And the wrestling's a really difficult sport because there isn't a lot of people in the stands. And it's painful, and you got to cut weight. It's all of life. It's not you show up. I mean, if you're going to be a high-level wrestler, it affects all your life. Being with other guys who understand you and are doing it with you carries you through the hard work. Ministry is hard work. If you don't have the relationship and you haven't defined disciple accurately, it's all about just what you know and can do, and it's not about the relationship part of it that carries us through the hard things. You're not really making disciples. And the version of the church that people are living, the recipe that they've come up with, Jesus said the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. But he didn't say the gates of hell will not prevail against a church. It has to be his church. Well, his church is known for love and relationship and commitment and faithfulness and each of us doing our part and doing it together. It's a team thing. He's not going to bless something that isn't his. Sometimes he will in spite of it if we're aspiring to, but it's also not going to be the kind of experience that God wanted you to have with brothers, with sons in the faith and fathers in the faith and uncles and aunts.
It doesn't have the longevity for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. And really that's what this podcast is about. And I want to encourage you guys that are out there listening to email us these questions at info@jimputman.com. And we do have time now for one question, and it's a tough one, and it goes right along with what we're talking about. Let me play devil's advocate. Yes, I realize who I'm working for. If I'm playing devil's advocate, and I'm out there, and I'm one of these guys that are watching, and they have a church that, they're frustrated with, they wished it would grow, and they're hearing this, and it's like, okay, yeah. I hear your story. It's a lot easier because you were a church planner. You started with a clean slate, and you could build it from the ground up. You could do those things. So the question would be, and this is a long form question, so let me get there. The question would be, how would if instead of leaving Oregon City to plant a church, what if you left Oregon City to plant a church that was existing, smaller, and
so not planning, you're going to an existing
you're going
church.
to an existing church, knowing, because you and I have been around churches a long time, it's not just the guy up front that wants
Makes
to be the
rules.
coach.
Yeah.
It's the guys that are in the bleachers that want to continue to be spectators. So it's this.
But want to have control over what you do on the stage.
That's exactly right. And it's, hey, my dad has had this job. I've been in this role for, my personality is tied up into the fact I count the money after the offering. Or
I'm
whatever.
the elder of the church.
That's exactly right. So it's a relationship that is, everyone's all in on this church not growing and continuing to stay the way it is. The people are, and the preacher is. The preacher tries to, hey, we're going to change things up, and it's really, there's a lot of momentum that's against that because they want to keep.
Well, you're describing my Oregon City experience.
Yeah,
I mean, there were people that wanted to change the church, but the majority didn't. And I wasn't going to split the church. It's not my church to split. So I was going to go to a different church or plant a church. I wanted to go to a different church. I didn't want to plant a church. But we have a network, the Relational Discipleship Network, that it's all guys who have helped shift their existing churches all around the world, all around the country, and how that happened. And there are times where you can't. We've had guys who there was just no way that they were going to be allowed to do anything, but they went and tried. And I always tell people the first thing you do is don't announce the revolution. You go and just make disciples.
yeah,
Go start a small group, make disciples. And don't ask other people. A lot of pastors were never disciples. So the one who ought to be the first one to make the mistakes and learn how to do it is you. Go make disciples. We've got all kinds of material at Relational Discipleship Network that came through Real Life and others, but go make disciples. No one's going to tell you you can't make disciples. They may tell you you can't start a small group system where disciples, but you shouldn't start with a small group system anyway. You start personally. You can't lead where you haven't gone. You can't ask others to do something you haven't done or you're not doing. So start with you. And as it grows, as we start going, well, now I've got guys who I can have. Now we have 2 groups and 4 groups, and people start noticing a change. Right. And now you're preaching from real stories you're having with real people instead of something you did back at Bible college or reading somebody else's story.
You're calling out the guy that's in row 3.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know where your people are at because you're with them. A lot of times
That's
people are
good.
in their office creating sermons based on what they think their people need to know when they don't know their people to know what they really need to know. And because they're not with the people.
Yeah.
It just changes things. Now, again, there are people that go, no, you're not even going to make disciples. I won't even let you start a small group. There is a time to leave a church. There's a right way to leave a church. You don't, fight like the devil for the things of God. There's a right thing to do. But oftentimes, if you don't announce the revolution and they start to see the changes and you start at the right spot, there are churches all across the country, in every part of the country, that have made the shift. And so we have a network where those who have been through the shift help coach those who are going through the shift. And so that's that's the Relational Discipleship Network that we put together that came from here. But there is a time in Oregon City, they were like, no, we're not making any changes. We want it the way we want it. And there's a time to leave. It's not the first thing you do. But there may be a time to do it. Then how you do it really matters. So,
well, I think I even think about starting real life. There was you came out and gave that vision of this is what the church was going to be like, and my biggest struggle I had was because I thought about what you said. I went back and started reading the New Testament really about church. And what I couldn't find was the church I was in, and all I could find was the church that you were talking about.
Yeah.
But there was a small group of people here, and when you first got here, but everybody kind of had their own idea what that church was going to be like. So in a situation where I agree with don't announce the rebellion, I agree with everything you said. But there are individuals.
We'll call it a revolution instead of a rebellion.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
it is a revolution.
Right.
That's right. It's not a rebellion. There were people that had their own agenda.
Yeah.
But instead of just making a big brush stroke, you had conversations with people individually about where they wanted to go and what the church was going to be, even though we didn't even have a church then. I was thinking about, let's say I would have bought a bunch of hymnals, hypothetically. You instead of just reacting to that and making a decision, you would have had a conversation with that individual and tried to move them. The reason I'm bringing that up is I don't want them to think that, okay, we've got these people that are on board with discipleship, these people that are they're relationally connected and they're starting to grow individually together and towards Jesus, and that's the goal. And you have these other people that don't want to make changes. They don't want to grow.
They left the church for a specific reason. And it's so funny, they left the church, but sometimes they want to recreate what they left. And I'm like, you left that church. If that's what you wanted, go back to it.
Just like the Israelites coming out of Egypt.
Yeah. And you have to be strong with a conviction to go, the Bible's going to be our guide, right? But there's things that are preferential that you're going to choose that may be different than their preferential. And you have to get people aligned, and you have to go, hey, here's what we're going to be about. And you're right. That's why I love winning unsaved people to the Lord, because they don't come with all these preconceived notions of past churches and things. We'll talk about this in the Church's Team Sport book later on, but the membership class, and here's where we're going, and here's what we're about, from the get-go, sets the stage. They can come or they can go based on that. Every year, a sports team, you're in a sports team, there's a coaches meeting, the parents come, there's a covenant that you sign. Parents, you're not coming off the stands, this is where you're coming, this is what time we practice, this is the playbook. And, when I moved from Coeur d'Alene to Rathdrum, We loved Coeur d'Alene, but we moved. So we come to the Rathrum meeting, and they have this meeting, and here's what we're doing, and here's the coaches, and here's the playbook. And if I were to say, hey, I don't want to play football like that. I like the way that the Coeur d'Alene playbook looked, and they didn't go, oh, well, okay.
Right.
They went,
no. Yeah, this
well, then go back to
yeah.
Coeur d'Alene. This is the way we're going to play, and this is what we've decided as a leadership team, and here's where we're going, and we invite you to come, but this is what it's going to look like. And there's that piece that's a coach. It's not trying to make everybody happy, but at the same time, not being a dictator the way you go about things. And we'll talk about all that as we go through the podcast.
But the biggest thing is you didn't lump a group of people and said, okay, this group of people in your head, this group of people aren't going to come with us, and so now we're going to do something with them, or I'm going to leave. You broke that group into people, and you're tried to
relationally. You go and meet with them
individually, yeah. And you think about the Good Shepherd. I always watch a sheepdog, and it's like, no, it's really for when you're running a church or in church leadership. It's more like a sheepdog, because they're constantly moving the herd. Where are they aligned? Where are they out of line? You gotta bark at somebody, but it's basically, are you getting everyone moving in the same direction in a pretty tight pattern for their own good? But it's a lot of work.
Again, though, coaching, right? There's individual parts of coaching and corporate parts of coaching. There's the big meeting, and then there's individual coaching. There's the telling them what to do, but it's also understanding where they're at and speaking to them like a person. They're not just an athlete; they're a person. There's trying to get them. Doesn't matter how much talent you have, if you're not using the same language and you're not on, you don't have the same goals. Doesn't matter how much talent you have in a team sport. Which is why we wrote church is a team sport. It's not individual, and my job isn't to try to figure out how to make everybody in here happy. How is that even possible?
Yeah,
But that's the role of God. God's job is to personalize my own form of the gospel so that I can accept let's each negotiate our own personal contracts with God. No, he set the terms, right? In church, it's like, I want a church that meets my needs, and if they don't meet my needs, I'll go to another church that will meet my needs. And when I find out none of them do, I just will have my own personal me and Jesus in the woods sort of relationship. None of that is scriptural. And when pastors try to give into that, you will never win.
Yeah.
And so, but again, it's coaching, which is right there in Scripture. Everything I'm saying is right there in Scripture.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jim. A lot of good tools, and we're going to have more tools coming out of church as a team sport. We really, really want things for you to be able to invest in your own congregation, invest in yourself, and build a winning team. So make this a part of your normal podcast watching, and we'll be here, and we'll be ready to talk about it together as a group. Like I said, if you have questions, we'd love to answer them at info@jimputman.com.